The Sword by Jason Halstead, published by Novel Concept Publishing LLC, copyright 2024. Part 1.
Cromlin sifted through the mounds of treasure. A few finely cut gemstones found their way into his pockets in his quest to find something truly amazing. Looking back over his shoulder, he saw that his only surviving companion was still inspecting the body of the dragon they'd slain. The burly warrior's singular focus meant he paid no attention to either Cromlin or the treasure. Cromlin's hand struck something hard while sifting through the pile of coins. He looked down and brushed the copper and silver coins away from the object to reveal what lay beneath. A bejeweled sword hilt lay amidst the treasure, the blade still buried. He drew the sword out of the treasure very slowly. It was beautifully wrought with a 4-foot-long blade. A weapon this sturdy and long wasn't his style. He preferred shorter one-handed blades, and this one would take him too. Even Martak would be hard-pressed to... No, that was silly. Martak would never hold this blade. It was too fine for that simple oaf. Cromlin lifted it and marveled at how well it moved, almost as though it was slicing through the air. The balance was flawless. The grip felt so natural and the sword moved so easily. Even in one hand, it might as well have been an extension of his arm. Not only could he use this weapon, he would use this weapon. He had to. It was meant for him.
Cromlin, get yourself over here,
his burly companion shouted.
Coming,
Cromlin replied as he slid his newfound weapon into its scabbard and slipped the baldric over his shoulder and neck.
What's that?
Martak asked as Cromlin joined him near the dragon's corpse.
Just a new sword I found.
Kind of long for you, innit?
No, it's lighter than it should be, and it looks nice. Probably some rich dandy's sword he paid a wizard to enchant. Then, when it came time to actually use it, he was too scared to draw it, and the dragon roasted his carriage.
Martak grunted and quickly lost interest. Cromlin stared down at the fallen beast and felt a fire seize his belly. He drew his sword without thinking and plunged it into the corpse in a blur of motion.
What the hell you doing?
Cromlin stared at the steel buried to the hilt in shock. He withdrew the blade and stammered,
I don't know. I guess I was angry at how our friend died at this beast's claws.
Martak glared at him and then shrugged, grunted, and started searching for anything valuable they could easily carry. Cromlin stared down at the blade in horror. He'd never done anything like that before. The rage had been overwhelming. The result, butchering the dead, filled him with smug joy. It had been vile and unnecessary, but he'd reveled in it. Desecrating the dead, beast or not, was not something he'd ever done before. He went to sheathe the blade, but paused when he realized something about the sword in his hands. The grip was warm even through his gauntlets. Comfortably warm. The sword's blade was pristine. No blood soiled its surface or marred its sheen. He slid the blade home in its scabbard and wiped his hands against one another. After finding a few more valuables and a suit of fancier chainmail than the off-patched mail he wore, Cromlin and Martak left. They buried their wizard friend Donegal just outside of the dragon's cave. With the sun still high in the sky, the two men began the long trek back to town. A reward awaited them before they sought out some new adventure. A reward that might replace their horses that had run off into the wilds, at the very least. After a day of walking, they were forced by the setting sun to stop and make camp. Knowing that Martak wasn't much of a conversationalist, Cromlin sat down on a stump to take first watch. His thoughts soon wandered, and he found himself staring at his sleeping companion instead of the forest. He marveled at the man's trust. Sure, they'd been on a few adventures together with Donegal, but it was clear they had little fondness for each other. How simple it would be to slip his new blade between the man's ribs and make off with his share of the treasure. How long, he wondered, would it take a man the size of Martak to die from a sword thrust? He roused Martak soon after to take the second watch. Cromlin's hands were shaking a little with the strange thoughts and urges. He worried for a moment if Martak might try to kill him in his sleep and make off with the sword. He rolled over on his side and clutched his scabbard to his chest, protecting it from any such theft. Sleep came fitfully when at last it found him. After another half-day of walking, they made it back to Vollingdon. It was a small farming town with little of interest to raiders, unless those raiders happened to be dragons that enjoyed fat cattle and pretty young maidens.
It's dead.
Martok called as they marched down the main road of the town. Villagers in the street raised their heads. Others stepped out of shops and houses, drawn by the noise. A few recognized the adventurers, and word began to spread. Runners took off, spreading the word and causing the crowd to grow as more villagers abandoned their duties to come and hear for themselves of the victory. Quickly surrounded by the throng of eager villagers, Cromlin's chest tightened and a red haze filmed his vision. He lost his wits at the press of the crowd. A voice whispered in his head, leaving him outraged at the audacity of the insolent peasants. How dare they think they could surround him and touch him? In a flash of motion, he drew his new sword and held it above him. He brandished it, showing them their doom in the glint of the noon sun off the pristine blade. The townspeople near him fell down to their knees on the ground before him. Cromlin's smile was feral, more snarl than smile, though seeing them kneeling obediently, he began to gloat. Now they treated him as the lord he should be. Perhaps if he chopped the heads off a few of them. Cromlin pulled himself back from the edge. He blinked, clearing the haze from his eyes and his mind. What was he thinking? Why would he ever believe he could just butcher a few innocent people, even if it did make them fear and respect him, as he deserved? That wasn't the only way to earn their fealty, was it? Even if it felt right, as though this was his destiny. He gave another shake of his head. What was going on? What was wrong with him? He scrambled to cover for his behavior and said,
Now that I have your attention, Martok and I lost our wizard to the dragon we slew. Has any of you the skill of a mage?
He didn't even realize that he still brandished his blade high above his head. A man in the back of the growing throng of people said nervously,
I know a few small tricks, my lord. Brombar is my name.
Well, Brombar, show us what you can do.
The man concentrated for a moment, then raised his hand and said a single word. A pencil-thin beam of red light shot out from his index finger and struck a nearby shed. The small wooden building burst into flame and then exploded. All that remained was a crater where it once stood. Cromlin gasped with the others. Such power. Donegal had known many spells, but mostly they served to impress wenches at bars and befuddle merchants. This man, Brombar, had the makings of a true wizard. But was he a wizard that knew his place? Would he serve him, as all men should?
Impressive, Brombar. What would that do to a person?
Cromlin pointed behind the crowd to a man that was late to the gathering.
There, that man. Show us what it would do to him.
In response, Brombar turned, saw the man. He hesitated and looked back to Cromlin.
My lord?
Cromlin nodded.
Yes, do it. Everyone wants to see how mighty you are, Brombar, even that poor fool running. Show me. Impress me with your power and make me want to have you as my wizard.
Brombar nodded slowly. An eager gleam came into his eye. He turned back and began casting his spell. He struck the man square in the stomach and focused on channeling more of the deadly magic. The man screamed as his stomach and internal organs were charred and then burned open. His guts hissed as the power evaporated blood and ichor before it could fall to the ground. The magic continued to grow until the doomed villager was incinerated in an intense explosion. The crowd fell silent and turned back to look at Cromlin. Cromlin grinned. The crowd took his expression to heart and cheered at the magical prowess displayed. None of them paid any mind to the young girl that ran out to find where her father had gone. No one heard her cries as she scorched her feet on the blackened ground.
Well done, Brombar. As you may know, my name is Cromlin, and this is Martok. Would you care to join us in our adventuring life?
My lord, I would follow you wherever you commanded.
Loyal, isn't he?
Cromlin said to Martok. Martok grunted. He wasn't looking at the wizard or at Cromlin. His eyes were on the sword, gleaming with a hungry light normally reserved for the beauty of another man's wife. Cromlin, living up the moment, played up the crowd.
We shall leave this noble village tomorrow. Your oppressor is gone, and his riches await those brave enough to seek them out. I ask only one thing. Which of you will host us this fine night and show proper appreciation to your saviors?
Cries of protest went up, first because Cromlin was going to leave, then because they all wanted to play host to him. Fights began to break out. Cromlin smiled and let them decide amongst themselves. Yes, this was the way it should be around him. For too long, he'd been an unknown warrior among the masses, unappreciated and cast aside. His due had come at last. They would know his name far and wide, and he would build on that. More than just the wizard, he would have others take up his cause. But what was his cause? Cromlin considered that only a moment before he knew. He would raise an army and rule these lands. All the lands in time. But for now, this was enough. After all, it would take time to teach these bumbling slaves to fight.
Part 2.
Cromlin smiled. It had been a while since he had slept without the worry of a threat of some sort. This peasant, whatever his name was, had impressed Cromlin by beating 3 other men and then offering Cromlin not only his wife's finest roasted hen, but also his wife. Cromlin had agreed, and his only regret is he hadn't made the man show him his wife first. She was a homely sort, and no amount of ale would convince him otherwise. Once, maybe, but not now. Now Cromlin knew he deserved only the best in food, in wine, in women, and in song. Those that offered less would be skewered upon his sword. 2 rooms as well, next time. Martok and he had been forced to share a small room. Martok was sitting on his bed running a whetstone over his double-edged battle axe. He might have been more quiet than normal, but Cromlin didn't care. The man served no purpose other than the strength of his arm. Perhaps Brombar would be a bit more talkative than Martok. That would be a welcome change of pace, although the first thing he must do is determine what his plans were before he could set them in motion. Brombar would play a part in them. That much he was certain. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a great many things, a new life and new opportunities. Martok watched out of the corner of his eye while Cromlin lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling, plotting his future. Martok waited, his movements slow and methodical and designed to help lull the man to sleep. He waited until at last Cromlin's breathing became even and regular. Martok stood, moving with a slow grace Cromlin would never have guessed the man capable of. He stepped over to the sleeping warrior, taking care to move slowly from heel to toe to avoid making noise. With a shaking hand, he reached down and touched Cromlin's sword. Martok spat out a whispered curse as he wrenched his hand back from the hilt. His fingers had been burned. Cromlin's eyes snapped open. He pulled the sword free of its scabbard without a word. Martok opened his mouth to speak, but saw the rage in Cromlin's eyes. There was more than rage. There was almost an inner light to them, a red light that made the warrior's pupils seem like slits. Martok managed a quick step back and grabbed his battle axe from where he'd left it on his pallet. His burnt fingers forgotten, he swung it with all of his might at Cromlin's head. Cromlin ducked the blow and thrust upwards with his sword. Martok's axe was back in time to block it. Martok parried the sword with the axe's edge and swung the end of the haft up into Cromlin's face, breaking his nose. Cromlin fought on, ignoring the wound and the blood that poured from his face. He lifted his sword and swung down in hopes of cleaving Martok's skull in twain before the man could recover. Cromlin found himself pulling the sword back closer to his body, his reaction overridden by instinct that didn't make sense. Martok's axe swept across, missing the parry that would have saved his life had the warrior continued his assault. Cromlin was thrusting his blade forward, even as he heard a whisper urging him to drive the blade home. Martok looked down, stunned by the steel emerging from his chest. The shock faded as a horrible agony ripped through him. He opened his mouth to scream, but he couldn't. His body was fighting against the ghastly wound, pulling back at the powerful suction that ripped his breath and his life from his chest. The sword turned pink, then blood red. Finally, after several seconds, Martok's bloodless corpse collapsed. Cromlin staggered back and fell onto Martok's sleeping pallet. He stared at his fallen companion and then looked at the blade in his hand. The whispers were gone. The thirst for blood and for power was silent. The desire that came with it lay dormant, sleeping. The sword was sated.
What have I done?
Cromlin moaned. He lifted the sword and then drew it back and tried to hurl it away from him. His fingers betrayed him. They remained locked around the hilt, clutching it tight. Somebody timidly knocked at the door.
My lord, is everything all right? We heard noises.
Go away.
Cromlin shouted. The door opened slowly, squeaking as rusty hinges will. The peasant's homely wife looked in.
Is there a problem, my lord? Perhaps.
She started to say until she saw the emaciated corpse on the floor. She screamed and took a step back before falling to her knees. The sword pulsed in his hand. The blood-red hue of the blade paled as a surge of warmth rushed up Cromlin's arm. A new anger seized him. He jumped forward and swung the weapon. The woman's head struck the door with a wet thud and then bounced back and rolled to a rest beside Martak. Her body stood still for a moment in time, blood pulsing from her severed neck as it realized it was dead. Her body crumpled to the floor in a puddle of her blood. Cromlin looked at what he had done and felt clarity again. He shook his head and gasped.
No, I can't.
Cromlin stepped over the woman and threw the door aside. He ran through the house and fled into the night before the peasant could investigate. Cromlin knew without looking that the sword was still in his hand. He needed space, and he needed to find a way to rid himself of the accursed weapon. He tried to drop it and then to throw it. When those didn't work, he swung it at a passing tree, only to nearly twist himself around before he ripped the impossibly keen blade free from the bark. Cromlin's next thought was to smash his hand against a tree or a rock. He ran through the woods with no thought to how far he went, only that he find a suitable rock. He did, at last, and swung his hand down. His arm cramped mid-swing, and he jerked it aside, grazing his knuckles and leaving a smear of blood on the rock. He stared at the blood, not stunned that it was there, but shocked that he didn't feel anything. Cromlin turned his hand over and saw the skinned knuckles and the blood that ran from them. Blood on his hand meant his grip would be loose. He tried again to fling the sword away, but he could not release it. Cromlin let out a sob of frustration. He didn't know what to do. Could he cut his hand off? Maybe with Martak's axe. He turned and looked around. Where was Vallington? He shook his head and searched the ground. It was dark, and he was a poor tracker in good weather. He was panting hard too, his entire body tingling now. He had to get away. He had to find help. An axe, a priest, anything. Cromlin ran, the forest growing thicker the further he went. He didn't care. He had to get away from those people. People he'd laughed at and slaughtered. He glanced over his shoulder, certain he'd heard a stick breaking behind him. Were they after him? Had the peasant come to avenge his wife? Had Brombar sought out his lord, eager to do his bidding? Had Martak risen from the dead to stalk him? Anything seemed possible in this nightmare he was living. Cromlin lurched forward, his foot finding nothing to land on. He twisted and looked down into the dark forest below. The rocky wall of a cliff raced behind him, too far to reach to slow his fall. The trees caught him, slapping and stinging with their branches and bouncing him to and fro like an upended barrel on a ship during a storm. He was twisted and flipped by the branches, the sword never slipping from his grasp until the very end. His relief was gone almost before it began, for the pommel struck the ground first, and the tip of the blade sawed through his nightshirt and flesh. He reclaimed it then, grabbing the hilt to pull it free of his chest. The agony he'd seen on Martak's face gripped him, sharing what it had been like for him. The pain stayed with him as the forest faded around him. Peace did not come for him, as he dared to hope. What came instead burned his very soul from his body, until there was nothing but torment left behind.
The end. Thank you for listening to The Sword by Jason Halstead. If you enjoyed this quick little adventure, give it a like and don't forget to subscribe.